Somewhere inside a fertility clinic freezer, in a petri dish no bigger than a fingernail, a decision is already being made. Long before a heartbeat can be heard, before a face begins to form, something inside that clump of dividing cells is quietly choosing which hand will one day hold a pencil, throw a ball, or sign a name. And here's the strangest part. About 9 to 10% of people on Earth are left-handed. That number has stayed remarkably stable across cultures, across centuries, and even across different species of primates. For most of human history, nobody had the faintest idea this decision was even happening. Parents assumed it was a habit. Teachers assumed it was a flaw to be corrected. Priests in some eras assumed it was something darker entirely, and for most of human history, that assumption came with a punishment. Then, in the last few years, something changed. Geneticists scanning the DNA of hundreds of thousands of people stumbled onto a signal buried deep inside the human genome. A signal connected not to muscles, not to upbringing, but to the microscopic scaffolding that builds the brain itself. What they found didn't just explain why some people favor their left hand. It forced scientists to rethink what handedness actually is, where it comes from, and why evolution allowed something so seemingly disadvantageous to survive for millions of years without disappearing. If left-handedness were purely a random accident or purely a product of upbringing, you would expect that number to drift wildly from place to place. It doesn't. Whether you look at hunter-gatherer societies, ancient farming communities, or modern industrial nations, the ratio keeps landing in almost the same narrow band. That kind of consistency is the fingerprint of biology, not culture. Ancient artwork already hints at the mystery. Cave paintings in France, dated to roughly 30,000 years ago, show handprints stenciled onto rock walls. Researchers who studied the angles and placement of those prints noticed something curious. A disproportionate number appear to have been made by left-handed individuals, based on the way the paint was blown or pressed around the hand. If that interpretation holds, it means left-handedness isn't some modern deviation. It has been part of the human story since before agriculture, before writing, before cities. So why does evolution keep it around? That's the question scientists are still wrestling with. A question that leads all the way back to a 3-week-old embryo spinning microscopic hairs and a molecular clock that decides where your heart goes. The Latin word for left is sinister, and that word didn't stay a neutral label. It soaked up meanings of evil, misfortune, untrustworthiness. The French word for left, gauche, became shorthand for awkward and clumsy. Across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, children who reached for things with their left hand were physically corrected. Left arms bound to bodies, hands slapped away from the table. In parts of the 20th century, school teachers still forced naturally left-handed children to write with their right hand, convinced they were fixing a bad habit rather than fighting biology. Some even tied the offending hand behind a child's back for hours. The suspicion ran deeper than the classroom. In several cultures, handing someone food with your left hand was, and in some communities still is, deeply disrespectful. Medieval folklore went further, linking left-handedness to accusations of witchcraft. An unusual physical trait became outward evidence of an inward moral flaw. Early psychologists in the 19th and early 20th centuries treated hand preference as learned behavior, shaped by parents, shaped by tools designed for the right hand, shaped by social pressure, and it made intuitive sense. You can force a child to switch hands. Doesn't that prove it was just a habit all along? But researchers who looked closer noticed something habit alone couldn't explain. Even after aggressive right-hand training, people who had been forced to switch still showed clear signs of underlying left-hand dominance. In their footedness, in which eye they instinctively used to aim a camera, in subtle patterns of brain activity. You could suppress the behavior, but you couldn't erase whatever was generating it underneath. The ultrasound changed everything. In the 1980s and 1990s, researchers turned these devices on pregnant women and watched fetuses long before birth. What they saw was startling. By around 15 weeks of pregnancy, many fetuses already showed a consistent preference for sucking one particular thumb. Not a random choice, a preference. Follow-up studies made the finding even stranger. That prenatal thumb preference predicted, with striking accuracy, which hand the child would favor years later. After any parental influence, after any exposure to right-handed scissors or right-handed desks, Left-handedness, it seemed, was being decided before a baby ever took its first breath. That discovery reframed the entire question. If the preference exists before birth, before any learning could plausibly occur, then the explanation had to live somewhere inside biology, most likely inside the developing nervous system, possibly inside the genetic instructions guiding that development. For decades, though, geneticists ran into a frustrating wall. Handedness clearly runs in families. Left-handed parents are more likely to have left-handed children than right-handed parents are, but it doesn't follow simple inheritance patterns. Two right-handed parents can have a left-handed child. Two left-handed parents often have children who turn out right-handed. Identical twins who share essentially the same DNA frequently don't share the same hand preference at all. Sometimes they develop as mirror images of each other, one twin favoring the left, the other the right, as if some coin was flipped independently inside each developing embryo. That twin data became one of the most puzzling clues in the entire investigation. If handedness were controlled by a single gene, the way eye color roughly is, identical twins should match almost perfectly. They don't. Estimates from large twin studies suggested that genetics accounts for somewhere around a quarter of the variation in handedness, an important chunk. But far from the whole story, the rest seemed to come from something else entirely. Something scientists came to call developmental noise, the countless small, unpredictable events that occur as an embryo grows. Tiny variations in cell division, in molecular signaling, in the physical environment inside the womb that can nudge development one way or the other, even when the underlying genetic instructions are identical. So here's where the search stood. The preference is real. It's decided before birth. But the genetic explanation kept slipping away. No single gene, no clean inheritance pattern. Just a quarter of the story written in DNA, and the rest lost in a fog of biological chance. The breakthrough didn't come from studying handedness at all. It came from a rare condition called situs inversus, where a person's internal organs are arranged as a mirror image of the normal layout. Heart on the right side of the chest instead of the left. Liver on the left instead of the right. Scientists studying this condition were trying to understand how the body decides its left-right axis in the first place. During the earliest days of embryonic development, a ball of identical-looking cells figures out which side is which. This left-right decision happens astonishingly early, within the first few weeks after conception. It's driven by microscopic hair-like structures called cilia that beat in a coordinated rotating motion inside a tiny structure at the center of the embryo. This rotating flow of fluid creates a chemical gradient, with subtly different concentrations of signaling molecules on the left side compared to the right. That asymmetry spreads outward, telling developing organs where to form. If this process gets even slightly disrupted, you can end up with organs on the wrong side of the body, as seen in situs inversus. Here's where the story takes its first genuinely unexpected turn. Researchers studying the genes involved in this organ positioning process began to wonder whether the same molecular machinery that decides left from right for your heart and liver might also play a role in deciding left from right for something entirely different: the wiring of the brain. It was a bold hypothesis, linking internal organ placement to something as seemingly unrelated as which hand a person prefers to write with. But the biology, once researchers dug into it, started to line up. In 2019, a team led by scientists including Akira Weiberg and Gwenaëlle Dewad at the University of Oxford analyzed brain imaging and genetic data from a massive resource called the UK Biobank, a database containing health information from roughly 500,000 people. Using this data, they compared the genomes of thousands of left-handed individuals to those of right-handed individuals, searching for tiny variations in DNA that appeared more often in one group than the other. This kind of large-scale genetic comparison is called a genome-wide association study, and it works a bit like scanning millions of tiny switches across the entire genetic code, looking for the handful that seem to correlate with a particular trait. What they found pointed to several regions of the genome linked to genes involved in building microtubules, microscopic tube-like structures that act almost like an internal skeleton and transportation system inside cells. Microtubules aren't just structural scaffolding. During brain development, they guide the growth of nerve cells, helping direct how neurons extend their long, thin projections and connect to one another across the two hemispheres of the brain. One standout gene highlighted in this research was called MAPT2, a gene known to be active in the developing brain and involved in organizing this microtubule network. Think of a microtubule as scaffolding on a construction site. Except this scaffolding is alive, constantly assembling itself and hauling molecular cargo along its length, physically pulling growing nerve fibers into place as an embryo's brain wires itself together. If that scaffolding is built with slightly different genetic instructions, the resulting wiring pattern can end up subtly different too, not broken, simply organized along a different blueprint. So the genetic signal points to the scaffolding that builds the brain. But what does that actually mean for how left-handed brains are wired? The brain scans added the physical proof. Left-handed participants showed measurable differences in the structural connectivity between the brain's two hemispheres, specifically in the regions that handle language. And these differences lined up with the same microtubule-related genetic variants. So the genetic signal wasn't a statistical shadow, it was tied to something real and physical. The wiring itself was different. This is where the whole question flips. Left-handedness isn't about which hand happens to be stronger or more coordinated. It looks like a visible symptom of something deeper, a difference in how communication is organized between the two halves of the brain. And that difference traces back to the same left-right patterning system that decides where your heart and liver end up. The hand you write with might be one of the only outwardly visible clues to an asymmetry running through the entire architecture of your brain. Now, about that old myth. The idea that left-handed people are more right-brained and creative, while right-handed people are more left-brained and logical, that's not what the neuroscience shows. Here's what it actually shows. Roughly 95% of right-handed people process language predominantly in the left hemisphere. Among left-handed people, that number drops to about 70%. That's a real, measurable difference. It's just not a difference between creativity and logic. But the story doesn't end with a single elegant gene. Handedness is what geneticists call a polygenic trait. It isn't controlled by one gene acting like an on-off switch, but by the combined cumulative influence of many genes, each contributing a small nudge in one direction or another. No single gene could explain the trait on its own. Instead, left-handedness emerges from a mosaic, a combination of many small genetic influences layered on top of prenatal developmental processes, layered again on top of a considerable amount of pure biological chance. That combination helps explain something that had puzzled scientists for generations. Why identical twins sharing the same DNA can still end up with different hand preferences. If handedness depended on a single gene, twins should almost always match. But if it depends on dozens of genes interacting with random developmental noise during those crucial early weeks of embryonic growth, when the cilia are spinning and the chemical gradients are forming, then even genetically identical embryos could plausibly land on different outcomes, like two coins with slightly weighted edges that still don't always land the same way. That persistence, that stubborn refusal to be eliminated, would become a scientific mystery of its own. The persistence of left-handedness, at that stubbornly stable 10%, became a scientific mystery on its own. Why hadn't natural selection simply erased it? The answer, proposed by French scientists Charlotte Faure and Michel Raymond in the early 2000s, has nothing to do with everyday tool use. It has everything to do with combat. In a world of physical confrontation, ancient hand-to-hand fighting, or modern boxing and fencing, a left-handed competitor holds a genuine tactical edge. Most opponents have spent their entire lives training against right-handed attackers. A left-handed fighter throws punches from an unfamiliar angle. A left-handed fencer's blade approaches from a direction instincts aren't calibrated for. Faure and Raymond found supporting evidence by comparing handedness rates across societies. In cultures with historically higher levels of interpersonal violence, left-handedness appeared at somewhat higher frequencies. The pattern suggests that being left-handed conferred a real survival advantage in combat, an edge strong enough to keep the trait from being weeded out, even while the everyday inconvenience of a right-handed world worked against it. The advantage only works because it remains rare. If left-handedness became too common, opponents would simply adjust their instincts and training to compensate, and the edge would vanish. Rarity itself is part of what makes the strategy function. Evolutionary biologists call this negative frequency-dependent selection. A trait's benefit is tied directly to how uncommon it remains. Modern sport echoes the principle. In top-level fencing and boxing, left-handed competitors consistently make up a share of champions well above their 10% presence in the general population. Baseball left-handed pitchers face batters from an angle right-handed hitters get comparatively little practice against. Cricket bowlers, same principle. an advantage that exists only because most competitors are unprepared for it. Some researchers argue the answer isn't combat at all, but cooperation. In highly cooperative societies, tools and workspaces get standardized around the majority right-handed pattern. That shared predictability benefits everyone, so the pressure keeps left-handedness rare. But in more competitive, conflict-prone environments, the tactical surprise advantage becomes more valuable, pushing its frequency slightly higher. The stable global rate may represent a long-term evolutionary balance point, a tug-of-war between standardization and unpredictability, playing out silently across thousands of generations. Then there's a more brain-centered theory from British psychologist Chris McManus. His right-shift theory starts with brain lateralization. The left hemisphere specializes in language and fine motor control because it made neural processing more efficient. The brain didn't have to duplicate those functions in both halves. Under his model, most humans inherit a genetic factor that shifts them toward right-handedness and left hemisphere language dominance, but a meaningful minority don't inherit that shifting factor. They develop through essentially a 50-50 random process, ending up right-handed or left-handed with roughly equal likelihood purely by chance. That offers a mathematically tidy explanation for the stable 10% figure worldwide, and it dovetails neatly with the genetic and developmental noise findings from the modern DNA studies. Though, like the other theories, it remains a hypothesis actively discussed and refined, not a fully closed case. The studies that link left-handedness to health conditions are real, but they demand caution. Over the decades, researchers have reported statistical associations between left-handedness and a range of issues, certain autoimmune disorders, migraine, and more controversially, conditions like schizophrenia and autism spectrum disorder, where some research has suggested a higher rate of atypical or mixed-handedness. But it's essential to be precise here, because this is exactly the kind of finding that gets exaggerated. These associations, where they exist, are generally weak, they're inconsistent across different studies, and they're nowhere close to causal. Being left-handed does not mean someone is more likely to develop schizophrenia or autism. The vast, overwhelming majority of left-handed people live with no elevated health risk connected to their hand preference at all. What researchers suspect, cautiously, is that both handedness and certain neurodevelopmental conditions may trace back to shared, very early disruptions in how the brain organizes its left and right hemispheres during fetal development. Atypical handedness might occasionally be a subtle marker, in some individuals, of broader variation in brain lateralization. Not a cause of anything, just a sign that something else was happening too. There's also the persistent claim that left-handed people have shorter average lifespans. That traces back largely to a methodologically flawed study from the late 1980s. The study failed to account for one crucial detail. Older generations were far more aggressively forced to switch to right-handed writing as children. That skewed the comparison badly. Later, more rigorous studies with better controls found no meaningful difference in life expectancy between left-handed and right-handed individuals. It's a good example of how a flawed study can circulate as accepted fact for decades after the science has moved on. And it raises the question, if all these health fears are overblown, what does the actual genetic evidence say about left-handedness itself? The genetic variants tied to left-handedness in the largest genome studies didn't cluster in genes linked to disease. They showed up in genes involved in the ordinary healthy business of building a brain, the wiring, the cellular architecture, the scaffolding. Everything the DNA evidence currently shows points one way. Left-handedness is not a disorder, not a defect, not a sign that anything went wrong. It's a variation, one thread in the vast tapestry of ordinary human neurological diversity, no more abnormal than being tall or having curly hair or possessing perfect pitch. That reframing matters enormously given the history. For centuries, left-handed people were told implicitly and explicitly that something was wrong with them, that they needed correcting, that their instinct reflected a weakness of character, or in darker eras, spiritual corruption. The DNA evidence tells a fundamentally different story, one written not in superstition, but in molecular biology. Left-handedness emerges from an intricate, still only partially understood interplay between dozens of genes, prenatal cellular signaling systems, and the simple unpredictability inherent in how a human brain assembles itself from a single fertilized cell into billions of interconnected neurons. Researchers still need to determine precisely how variants near genes like MAP2 actually influence the developing brain at a mechanistic level, why the effect appears connected specifically to language-related brain regions, and how much of the remaining unexplained variation comes down to undiscovered genetic factors versus pure developmental randomness. Some scientists suspect that as genetic databases grow into the tens of millions of participants, even more subtle genetic contributors will be identified. But others believe a meaningful portion of the story may simply remain probabilistic, an acknowledgement that not every biological outcome traces back to a discoverable deterministic cause, that some of what makes us who we are emerges from a kind of built-in biological chance present, even at the level of DNA and cellular development. Which raises a question that cuts to the heart of the whole mystery. If the underlying developmental system driven by random cilia asymmetry might on its own be expected to produce something closer to a 50-50 split, why do humans lean so heavily toward right-handedness in the first place? There's still one question the science hasn't fully settled. Why do humans lean so heavily toward the right hand in the first place? The underlying developmental system, built on that random cilia-driven asymmetry, might on its own be expected to produce something closer to a 50-50 split, but it doesn't. And some researchers argue the answer lies in the evolution of language itself. As the left hemisphere became specialized for speech, it also became specialized almost as a side effect for controlling fine motor movements on the right side of the body. The hand that writes and the brain that speaks wired together by the same neural machinery. Under this view, right-hand dominance is a relatively late evolutionary innovation, layered on top of an older, more balanced system, one that a genetic minority of people simply never fully inherited. It remains an active hypothesis, not settled fact. But what makes this story so compelling isn't just the science, it's the way this single, seemingly small trait, something as ordinary as which hand a child instinctively reaches for a crayon with, ended up connecting some of the most fundamental questions in biology. How an embryo first decides its own left from right, how the two halves of the human brain divide labor, how evolution can balance advantage and disadvantage across a population rather than optimizing every individual. How much of what makes us unique is written into our genes versus shaped by the sheer unpredictability of biological development. A trait once blamed on stubbornness, poor discipline, even sinister character turns out to be a visible echo of some of the earliest, most delicate decisions ever made inside a developing human body. So, the next time you watch someone sign their name or see a child reach for a spoon with the wrong hand, remember what this really is. It looks like a trivial choice. In reality, it's the visible tail end of an extraordinarily intricate process, spinning microscopic cilia inside a 3-week-old embryo. Dozens of genes nudging microtubules into place inside growing neurons, and a healthy dose of pure biological unpredictability that no scientist has ever fully tamed. And there is something quietly humbling in that. For most of history, people looked at left-handedness and searched for someone to blame. Bad parenting, moral failing, sheer stubbornness. The DNA evidence offers no villain. No explanation nearly that simple. It offers something closer to a mirror, a reflection of how much of who we become is set in motion long before we have any say in the matter. That hand you write with? It's the echo of a decision made in the earliest days of a life that hadn't even begun yet. If that reframes something as ordinary as which hand you use, subscribe. There's more where this came from. And tell me in the comments, were you ever forced to switch hands? Or have you watched a child instinctively reach with an unexpected one?